Okay, well, welcome to the last of these 4 sessions. So far we've been thinking about questions to do with the investment in the Homeric past, the epic past, the heroic past, and the gaps between the culture of that period and readers from the first few centuries, in particular AD. Now, today we're going to be thinking about a sort of a specific version of that problem, which is the problem of the gods. This is something that's come up over the last few weeks in different ways. So we've looked briefly at what we might call the Elpenor problem, which is human beings blaming the gods for their own stupidity, or drunkenness, or forgetting about being on a roof, for instance. This is also something that came up with Helen of Troy last week, where we looked at her arguments and other people's arguments about Helen and the degree to which her decisions could be attributed to the gods, blamed upon the gods, or she could have any sense of personal agency stripped away from her in various ways. We've also thought a little bit in the last few weeks about the veracity of epic poetry, so the degree to which it was perceived as truthful or mythological, fictional, fantastical, and in a sort of more pejorative end of that sort of vocabulary, damaging in the sense of being deceptive or outright leading people into bad behaviour of all kinds. So today we're going to be thinking about the ways in which these really coalesce these different ideas. And we'll look at a couple of different moments in ancient kind of philosophical history, really, where the gods are criticised, and some of the strategies that were employed in antiquity to defend the gods. So we have seen in the last couple of weeks some of the arguments and criticisms of the Homeric epics that were put forward by the hero Protesilaus. So you may remember him enormously tall, striding around the plains of Troy and the sanctuary opposite in Thrace. An astute reader of Homer, we hear, and also, of course, himself a participant in the Trojan War, having been the first hero to die. We've looked at the ways in which he quite explicitly corrects or offers a sort of a tongue-in-cheek or, in some ways quite a thought-provoking correction of Homer. He is, however, an enormous fan of Homer. So he says, Homer chose as a subject the story of Troy. To it he added warfare against men, horses, walls and rivers, which is a wonderful encapsulation of different types of military activity, gods and goddesses, as well as all the pursuits of peace, dancing, song, love, banqueting, the life of the farmer, of course, particularly important for this farmer who is in conversation with Protesilaus. And remember, Protesilaus used Homer's agricultural precepts to correct the way he was actually going about his planting. So agricultural tasks, seafaring, again, quite pertinent for the Phoenician sailor who's come to have this conversation. The making of armour, the types of men and their varied characters. And this is in many ways typical of ancient ideas about Homer, which was that, this is not just poetry that treats of military strategy, for instance. It tells you about pretty much any subject under the sun. And that includes, of course, military strategy, things like rhetoric. So the Homeric characters were taken as exemplars of particular forms of rhetorical speech, for example. Homer was taken to be the inventor of disciplines, ranging from geography, astronomy, all kinds of things, agriculture and warfare alike, and particularly in things like the shield of Achilles or the similes that depict non-military life. So Homer was almost encyclopedic, it was thought, in terms of the subjects that his poetry taught. And there was a very strong strain in antiquity of regarding Homer as a teacher. So he was described very early on as the teacher of all the Greeks. And that, I want to argue today, is one of the reasons that he was both criticised and defended quite so vehemently. That this sense that the Homeric epics were not just entertaining but educative in some sense, that they had ethical and technical, sort of factual things to convey, that this set up a challenge that, probably wasn't, whatever we might think of authorial intention. The fact that the Homeric epics were being read in this way set up a challenge for later thinkers who, in contesting the Homeric epics, are contesting the idea that Homer can teach you everything under the sun, that every single detail of the Homeric epics can be read as in some way instructive, whether morally or in terms of its factual accuracy. So Protesilaus praises the variety of the material in the Homeric epics. And he says all these he worked out with divine skill. Again, a sort of a recurrent feature of ancient discussions of Homer is this divinity, and that plays out in all sorts of ways. It's a sense that the poet is a conduit to the world of the gods. The poet receives inspiration from the muses, receives in a way a form of divine knowledge. So the archaic, kind of early Greek poet or bard as a kind of a figure, a sage, almost a priest-like figure in some ways in his ability to access the world of the divine. That divinity, of course, gets reflected in the sort of eloquence, the beauty of this poetry. So there's sort of double divinity at work here. So those who don't love Homer are out of their minds, we hear. So Protesilaus, the hero who fought at Troy, calls Homer, well, he never quite got to Troy, but wanted to fight at Troy, calls Homer the founding hero of Troy, since it was through his lament for it that its fame began. So again, the idea that Homer here is really inseparable from the concept of the Trojan War and the sort of tales of heroic feats. So much for Protesilaus' praise of Homer. Compares him to all sorts of other poets and says, he's better in pretty much every respect. But he also offers three really important criticisms of Homer, and we've looked at two of these already. So one of these, the focus of last week's discussion, was the idea that even though Homer knew perfectly well that Helen was in Egypt, that she and Paris had washed up there because of a storm, he makes her go up onto the wall of Troy to watch the sufferings on the field and sort of enumerate the heroes and things like that. So there is a way in which the Homeric epics are quite deliberately deceptive. And this is part of Protesilaus' grievance, is that Homer knew precisely what was going on, but he chose not to represent that. And this will come back again and again in forms of criticism of the Homeric epics, that the poet is deliberately manipulating or distorting the truth, partly to make a more entertaining story. And one that therefore is not necessarily truthful, even though it is pleasing. So Helen was not, in fact, in Troy. She was in Egypt. His other criticism is that although his subject was Troy, he drops his story after Hector's death because he's in a hurry to get to the other one, i.e. the Odyssey, which he named after Odysseus. So we looked at this in the second week, that this poetry, the Homeric epics, are Odyssean propaganda through and through. And it's interesting, I think, here that this sense of having an Odyssean slant is a question of the objectivity of the narrator. So this is not simply a kind of historiographical account based on rational principles. This is very much told through one man's perspective in the case of the Odyssey. And he races through the Iliad, doesn't even get to the good bit. We never see the fall of Troy in the Iliad. He gives too much credit to Odysseus. He accuses Homer of making up the Cyclopes, having goddesses fall totally implausibly in love with Odysseus, all because of that pact that they made when Odysseus promised to tell him what had happened in return for his eternal glory. So criticisms then of Homer's deliberately distorting tendency and the way in which this plays out, both in terms of the content, the mythical subjects, but also the way the narrative is presented, the kind of narrative compression and obliquity that characterises both the Iliad and the Odyssey. But there's a third criticism of Homer that Protesilaus advances. In fact, this is his first and most powerful one. He says that Homer confuses the gods with men and says great things about men, but about the gods, petty and insignificant things. Now, I think there's a sort of irony in this, really, that this is voiced by Protesilaus, a human being who fought in the Trojan War and is now being honoured as a cult hero, who has sort of come back to life and is being worshipped more or less as a god. So there's a kind of a beautiful way in which this is played out. This criticism of Protesilaus actually gets to the heart of himself as a speaking subject. Nevertheless, he's not the first critic to advance this accusation against Homer that he confuses gods with men. Now, one of the most controversial passages in the Homeric epics is one where the gods very much do fight as if they were human beings. So this is in the Iliad, what's called the Theomachy, the battle between the gods, where we can think of throughout the Homeric epics the tendencies that the gods have to replicate human society. So they are embroiled in quarrels, they have affairs, they lie to one another, they deceive one another, they're constantly competing for status. So the same drives that animate the human plane, so the desire to be well regarded, to have high social status, to get a greater share of honours and rewards and the sort of structures of privilege that are seen as all important in heroic society. These two are revealed to be the driving motivational forces for the Trojan War and for the world of the gods. So we've seen this a little bit last week when we're looking at the way in which the Trojan War itself is started by, we might, however far you want to push that back, but the judgment of Paris, for instance, this competition of the gods for status and the prize of being the most beautiful. And we saw in the Trojan Women, Euripides' tragedy, that Helen advances this in her defence, and Hecuba, the queen, the elderly queen of Troy, says this is totally implausible that the gods would do this. Why do you think they would possibly care about something as superficial as a competition over which of them is the most beautiful? But nevertheless, that is how they are represented in the Homeric world. And this became immensely controversial, of course, throughout the ancient world. And I think that's the beauty of the Homeric epics. I mean, that's what's so intriguing about them, is the way in which the gods do bicker and fight and squabble. And there's a sort of almost a pettiness that counterbalances their grandeur and their sense of majesty. And that makes them, in a way, that their motivations to interfere in the battle, for instance, very plain to see. We can understand them because they're not beyond our comprehension as something that is immanent and immortal and infallible. No, they're more or less exactly as humans are. So the way in which this comes out most clearly in terms of mirroring human behaviour is when the gods don't just intervene in the battle but actually engage in it. So this is in Iliad 20, when as the gods start to clash, Zeus thunders and the whole earth quakes. This is such a wonderful passage that essentially even Hades is terrified that the world's just going to break open and that it's going to rip open and you'll be able to see directly into the underworld, and that's a terrifying prospect, and it's sort of dank and it's horrible and it's a really frightening prospect. So this is a battle that, it does mirror the workings of human battle, but it's on a truly cosmic scale. And the very signal for that battle threatens the stability of the cosmos itself. Then the gods line up against one another. So Poseidon lines up against Apollo, Ares fights Athena, Hera fights Artemis, Leto lines up against Hermes, and Hephaestus lines up against the river Scamander. Gods went out to meet gods. So this ends up in pitched battle where, again, there are kind of a series of very intense personal rivalries between the Olympians. Now, an ancient critic, Longinus, sometimes known as Pseudo-Longinus, writing on sublimity in ancient literature, tackles this passage. So, you see how the earth is split to its foundations, hell is laid bare. Everything, heaven and hell, mortal and immortal alike, shares in the conflict and danger of that battle. So in a way, he's saying there that the very idea that you will lose any sense of structure, that you are bringing kind of heaven and earth and underworld together, mirrors this sense that you're losing the distinction between human beings and gods in this passage. Terrible as they are, they're utterly irreligious and breach the canons of propriety unless one takes them allegorically. We'll come back to that in a minute. So in recording, as he does, the wounding of the gods, their quarrels, vengeance, tears, imprisonment and all their manifold passions, Homer has done his best to make the men in the Iliad gods and the gods men. So we have here, in the voice of an ancient literary critic, exactly the same criticism as Protesilaus, the hero, advanced through his readings of Homer, that the men are like gods and the gods are like men. So the heroes are larger than life. They're sometimes sort of descended from gods. And, we saw this early on when we were looking at that gap, that sort of fantasy of bridging the gulf between past and present, the heroic age and the current age. That is precisely why these heroes were of such interest, in a way that they are somewhere between gods and human beings, partly through their birth and partly through their kind of larger than life qualities, characteristics, ways of behaving and so on. So there is a criticism that the humans are godlike in all sorts of ways, the gods are all too human. Now, this kind of claim that the gods are all too human reverberated essentially throughout the ancient tradition. We have it here in a literary critical form here, so looking at what constitutes sublimity in poetry, but it was articulated most fiercely by philosophers in the ancient world. And this is partly, I think, about a battle really for control over the question of who talks about gods and how those are interpreted. So if Homer was seen as a poet who talked about all sorts of spheres of knowledge in the ancient world, but also about the very structure of the cosmos. So we've seen him commenting even briefly there on the way that the world is laid out. We looked at that in the first session as well, the kind of recourse to the idea of the ocean that encircles the world and so on. So Homer was conceived of as somebody who tells you how the world works, how divinity works, as well as how human beings and human society operates. And I think that is fundamentally the case, that, as Herodotus says, that Homer and Hesiod gave the Greeks their gods. So it is precisely this sense that Homer is a religious authority as well as an epic poet that means that he is subject to criticism. So one of the most famous criticisms advanced against Homeric depictions of the gods is that they are too anthropomorphic. They look and they behave like human beings. So Xenophanes of Colophon, a pre-Socratic philosopher from probably late 6th, early 5th century BC, it's very hard to piece together exactly the nature of his criticism. We've only got kind of fragments, essentially. But as he puts it, Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods all sorts of things that are matters of reproach and censure among men: theft, adultery, and mutual deception. Mortals suppose that gods are born, wear their own clothes, and have a voice and a body. So here we're really getting down to the heart of both physical and ethical anthropomorphism. So the idea that the gods behave in all sorts of immoral ways like humans do, and that they have the same fundamental sort of needs and habits and ways of clothing themselves and going about their daily lives. This was much parodied in antiquity, of course, and Lucian, for instance, really revels in kind of exploiting the potential of a very anthropomorphic religious system in antiquity, and he kind of plays around with that in all sorts of ways. This is one of my kind of favourite quotations on this issue when Xenophanes says that essentially Ethiopians say that their gods are snub-nosed and black, Thracians that theirs are blue-eyed and red-haired. So every culture imagines the gods in their own image. So we kind of simply project onto them. If horses or oxen or lions had hands or could draw with their hands, it's a terrifying thought, but if they could, then horses would draw the figures of gods similar to horses, oxen as similar to oxen, and they would make the bodies, each of them, that they each had. So, where does this end? Does every single form of life imagine a divine society and divine forms in precisely their own mould? So Xenophanes was probably the first ancient thinker to kind of offer a really systematic account of the divine. And I think that sense of being systematic and kind of investigating a topic with a sense of rationality and logic and, offering a comprehensive account is really important. So clearly what he's pushing back against here is the idea that Homer should be regarded as an authority on these subjects. He talks about Homer having educated all the Greeks. So it's very explicit. Again, we don't have the end of that quotation, that fragment. It probably contains some form of criticism. So those two are linked together. So we don't know quite what he's objecting to, but we can probably assume that Xenophanes himself holds that any divine being must necessarily be good and perfect. So this is the kind of fundamental problem with gods in Homer. They're neither good nor perfect. They're very far from it. They are petty. They're status obsessed. What do you do with a religious system where the god of justice is not himself just? He can be tricked and his decisions can be just as petty as the others under certain circumstances. So the gods do not necessarily uphold this sense of having a higher moral order than human beings do. And this, of course, this same kind of criticism lies behind the Platonic objection to poetry at large, but the poetry of Homer and Hesiod in particular. So Socrates claimed that that the poet should be banished from the ideal city in the sense of being deceptive and liable to lead people into bad forms of behaviour. So there is a kind of an implicit sense, partly that there is something blasphemous about describing the gods in this way, when the gods, should be seen as a more abstracted idea of divinity that is just and is perfect, and so on. But partly also a criticism of the status of the Homeric epics as educative, that people will be misled, they will be duped by this into imitating the gods or believing that these things are true. That people are fundamentally unable to differentiate between what is true and what is sort of pleasing and entertaining. That this is a deeply dangerous thing for us then in reading poetry. So these are some of the criticisms that were advanced about the gods in antiquity. And I want to just lay out a few of the strategies that were developed by ancient thinkers for addressing this problem. So with the fundamental problem is that poetry blends fact and fiction, piety and impiety, truth and slander. How are we to differentiate that? What are we to do with that? How can we defend the authority of Homer? Or do we simply have to banish him from our ideal city or our personal city, our own republic? What do we do with that problem? And I want to lay out kind of three strategies that were taken in the ancient world. Now, the first is the one that we would probably instinctively choose ourselves. So I like to think of this as really the fundamental problem of the internet age, is that you're surrounded by misinformation, disinformation, some of it active, some of it simply just sort of inadvertent, really kind of replication of untruths. What do you do in a world like that? Do you try to sort of insist that this material be excluded from people's purview. And again, in antiquity, this was very often a debate that centred around the young. So both for Socrates and, as we'll see, for other later figures, including the 1st century philosopher, moralist, anecdotalist, etc., Plutarch. So Plutarch himself wrote several commentaries and treatises on Homer, and took a wide array of different approaches to the Homeric epics across his oeuvre. I mean, he writes a phenomenal amount of literature, Plutarch, as anybody who's sort of delved into his materials knows, and that ranges from things like parallel lives of sort of important figures from history to treatises on the moon, to an idea of a talking Homeric pig. So a thought experiment in what one of the pigs, one of Odysseus's men, metamorphosed into the pigs by Circe, what they might say about life as a pig. So it's kind of really exploring a range of different ways of interacting with the Homeric epics. But his fundamental problem or starting point in this treatise is to say young men want their philosophy to be entertaining, that they won't read straight up philosophy. They're not serious enough necessarily. You need to entertain them. They need to be given a bit of myth, a bit of fiction, a bit of something interesting in order for them to swallow that pill. It's a sort of version of the honeyed cup argument put forward by Lucretius. But this same problem, it can be hard for youths in particular to distinguish between poetic truth and poetic entertainment. So in the first session, we were looking at that quotation by Heraclitus, whom we'll come to in a moment, that talks about the Homeric epics as a kind of a form of baby milk. If you remember that, the idea that we grow up with Homer, we consume Homer avidly all the way through our lives, and he's like sort of our nappies and our baby milk and our sustenance all the way through. But again, this problem that, as we all know, children don't necessarily read critically, and Plutarch here is focusing especially on sort of adolescents as they are learning. They're kind of going through that process of learning how to read critically, how to disentangle poetic truth and poetic entertainment. So they want poetry, so you can't just ban poetry. You can't just kick it out of your city and ban it from the syllabus. So this means that you have to learn, you have to adopt particular strategies for how best to read it, how to read it critically. So he says, well, actually poetry serves a really important function, even though it contains untruths. And Plutarch is quite interesting because he, to some extent, is imbued both with the influence of Homer, but also of Plato. So he's very interested in reconciling those two. So saying, okay, well, yes, it's true that this is a kind of a form of, there's a form of philosophy in this poetry, but that doesn't mean that we have to ban it altogether. There must be a way of saying, yes, there is something that's untrue as well as ethically sort of improving in this poetry, therefore our job. And I think this is probably what we would say as well when we try to teach people how to read critically, when we teach students or when people lurk on internet message boards and things like that, is you need to work out strategies for verifying the information that you come across. So Plutarch talks about various ways of doing this, including things like picking up on the subtle cues that an author like Homer gives you as to how to interpret particular episodes. He talks about things like needing to differentiate between what the author thinks and what a character says. Now, this seems fairly obvious to us, and again, is something that we teach students quite early on, but this wasn't necessarily the case in antiquity. So, huge numbers of the ancient biographies of particular poets and authors will attribute to that author things that are voiced by characters, even if they are sort of absolutely outrageous and very clearly provocative in that context or linked to their personal circumstances. So there's a tendency to conflate author and character. So Plutarch then says you just have to learn to read better. You need to be thinking strategically, and not everything that a poet says is designed to be imitated and taken as an example for how to live your life. Which again, chimes with what we might think. So, and I think it's worth bearing in mind that is responding precisely to that ancient tendency to find in Homer the sort of teachings on every single subject under the sun, and really to extrapolate from tiny, tiny details in the Homeric epics, huge amounts of assumed knowledge about all kinds of subjects. So people were reading the Homeric epics and saying, well, this tiny detail here proves that Homer knew X subject intimately, otherwise how would they have, why would he say this? So there is a tendency to read that into the Homeric epics. So others of his strategies are to say that not everything that is said about the gods in Homer is actually the truth. So some of it is designed to be entertaining and some of it is designed to be improving, and it's really down to you to select those. So what you have to do, and this is part of what Plutarch does in his works, and part of what people were doing in the imperial period generally, is to have a pretty comprehensive grasp and ability to quote sections of the Homeric epics that pertain to specific topics. So it might be the gods, so it might be drinking, it could be anything really, but you would be able to rattle off almost competitively, and in some cases explicitly competitively. We have these wonderful accounts of ancient symposia, so ancient dinner parties, where people are competing with one another to show off their knowledge and really exegetical knowledge as well, so knowledge of how to interpret Homer as well as just quoting Homer, and they do this again as a way of kind of gaining social status as well, and showing off their education, their paideia, their grasp of culture, and the Homeric epics were really very much seen as the core of that culture. So some of the key problems when ancient critics were tackling the Homeric epics are moments where the gods are perceived to behave badly or immorally. The story that is told, the song of Aphrodite and Ares engaging in adultery, told by the poet Demodocus to the Phaeacians, the peoples where Odysseus has sort of stopped off on been shipwrecked on his travels, and they're listening to the bard sing. So Aphrodite, of course, not married to Ares, married to Hephaestus, and that tale is about Aphrodite and Ares engaging in adultery. Again, Hera seducing and deceiving Zeus in Iliad 14, particularly so that she can then, and she tricks other gods into helping her. So Aphrodite helps her, and then Zeus falls asleep after their intercourse, and she's able to meddle in the battlefield. And we've already looked at this, the theomachy, the scene of the gods fighting one another. I think it's interesting, in general, the Iliad and the Odyssey have sort of slightly different versions of how the gods interact with human beings. The Odyssey has a much more pared back cast of gods, and it's much more explicitly moralising. We looked at this a little bit before. So there's a structure of transgression and retribution that's sort of built into the Odyssey in a way that is much less explicit, I think, in the Iliad. But Plutarch's approach then is to say that actually if you read quite carefully, you can see that there isn't really a sense that the poet is condoning adultery, for instance. So the story of Aphrodite and Ares, in a very literal sense, it's a story of them being caught out. All the gods laugh when Ares and Aphrodite are caught in bed together. But there is a problem because, they're sort of joking with one another and saying, well, I wouldn't mind being caught, with Aphrodite. That would be fine by me. So there's a sense that it is both a tale of transgression and punishment, in that they are made a spectacle of, that this ought at some level to be a tale about how if you commit adultery, you will be caught and punished. And yet that very moral structure is undermined by the fact that there's a sort of bit of of joking around and saying, well, actually, maybe I would choose that over the right thing to do. Plutarch, however, his approach is to say, well, actually, if you read quite carefully, the Phaeacians love this story. They're very entertained. This is told as a form of entertainment by the bard to court culture. But actually that court culture isn't being presented as the right kind of culture. So Odysseus stops off there for a limited amount of time before going home, and there's that sort of slight danger that he might be seduced into staying there. He might marry Nausicaa, the young eligible princess, but there is something not quite right about this culture. So Plutarch puts this in sort of slightly gendered terms as well, and says they're not really masculine enough. They spend all their time sort of eating and drinking and just enjoying salacious stories. So for him, the question is us understanding that just because a story is told and everybody enjoys it doesn't mean that we necessarily have to approve of it. Because if you read carefully enough, you'll understand that this is being held up by Homer, says Plutarch, as an example of what a sort of corrupt, decadent culture might enjoy. So in many ways, this is kind of reading against the grain in certain cases, some cases more than others. But it also requires quite a sort of sophisticated grasp of exactly where the sort of morality lies in the Homeric epics. So he's very keen to show that you can do this if you're a careful reader, but therefore you need to spend quite a lot of time honing those sensibilities. One thing that Plutarch very explicitly rails against is any kind of interpretation of passages like these allegorically. And allegorical interpretations we've already glimpsed from Longinus. So talking about the battle between the gods and the idea that gods and humans share in the conflict and danger. These passages are utterly irreligious and breach the canons of propriety unless one takes them allegorically. And I think kind of ancient allegorical readings of the Homeric epics are a particularly interesting phenomenon. And they, hugely populate in all kinds of corners of the ancient world, varying very widely in terms of sophistication. But allegorical readings depend on the idea, essentially, that what is literally being presented in a poem or a story is not the real underlying sense. So there is a kind of a deeper truth underneath. There's a kind of hidden meaning or a hidden set of symbols or a kind of that needs to be decoded effectively, a kind of series of non-literal meanings. And it's very clear from what Plato says in the Republic that even by the time of Plato, the whole of the Iliad and the Odyssey had already been interpreted allegorically. And there are kind of particular hotspots of passages that spark these kinds of questions and readings. Heraclitus, who in the 1st or 2nd century AD writes a treatise on Homer, essentially reading the Homeric epics. Not quite all of it survives, unfortunately, but offering a whole series of allegorical readings. So allegory is allo agoriro, he says, so saying something else, so saying something other than what it purports to say. So the gods can be interpreted in all sorts of ways, sometimes as personifications of elements or cosmic forces, sometimes as ethical attributes. So these were kind of often quite intricate in the ancient world and often very rooted in wordplay, and puns and etymology were hugely popular in the ancient world. Often these etymologies are totally made up, but they just connect two words that sound quite similar and then invent a kind of a plausible logic behind that similarity. And they can be, incredibly inventive and sort of baffling and weird in all sorts of ways. But some of these have Hera as heir, so era, something like that. There's Chronos as Chronos. Zeus, which goes in different cases into so Dia, so becomes Dia, the one through whom things happen. So once you start to kind of manipulate the language of the Greek, you can make all kinds of weird and wonderful connections and suppositions. And we're saying that a lot of these are pretty odd and they're quite strange, partly because they don't quite make sense. They have to do a lot of nifty sort of shape-shifting in order to fit the Homeric epics, because, of course, the Homeric epics were never conceived with this sort of reading in mind. So when we talk about allegorical readings or allegoresis, these are later reading strategies, as opposed to texts that are written or composed as allegories in the first place, in a kind of a moralising way. So there clearly isn't a very straightforward way of reading the Iliad and the Odyssey allegorically. You can come close to some degree, when you think about Odysseus as a kind of a paradigm for restraint in the face of temptation. It's not quite allegory, but it's sort of there are ways in which you can make it move in that direction. But the most popular allegorical readings in the ancient world were to do with either the kind of physical elements or with ethics. So as Porphyry puts it, so he's talking about the battle of the gods in Iliad 20. So he says, what Homer says about the gods is both damaging and unseemly. His myths about the nature of the gods are inappropriate. So this is very, very common language about sort of impropriety, what is appropriate, what is fitting, what is moral, what is educative. So the criticisms of Homer are that, to have the gods engage in adultery or trick one another or fight one another is not proper. How do you defend that? How do you say, well, actually, it is perfectly proper? Well, you make the gods actually not gods, but stand in for something else. So a lot of this, as we've seen, is linguistic. Everything he says is allegorical and is about the nature of the primal elements. So the earliest example that we seem to have of this is from Theagenes of Rhegium in the 6th century, so very, very early. I think it's really remarkable how early this comes into being as a sort of way of reading the Homeric epics. So in this example, as far as we can make out, again, the evidence is very fragmentary, but you have gods, so whether that's the sun gods or the gods of fire. So Apollo, Helios, Hephaestus stand for fire. Poseidon and the river Scamander stand in for water. Artemis for the moon, Hera for the air. So particularly for kind of celestial bodies or for the elements. In other schemes, you can have Athena, goddess, of course, of wisdom, standing in for wisdom. That's a very easy sort of switch. So that we know of one reading, for instance, of the moment where Achilles and Agamemnon are fighting at the beginning of the Iliad. Achilles' sort of immediate instinct is really just to fight Agamemnon to kill him there and then. Athena holds Achilles back by his hair. And we can see in the ancient allegorical readings that was interpreted not as the god physically coming down and holding him back, dragging him away by his hair, but as a second thought that is wiser than the first one. So the intervention, the sudden appearance of wisdom or good sense, stopping him doing something that would have been really stupid under the circumstances to kill his king. So sometimes that's easy enough to do. Elsewhere we have other allegorical readings that have things like saying, it wasn't actually that Poseidon knocked down the wall as a god, really it was either a tidal wave or an earthquake. So the fact that the gods are associated with these phenomena makes that a relatively easy move. In other cases, it's much less easy. But it seems to be that what Theagenes is doing here is in something slightly different. So it's not simply saying that, you can see some cases where Athena is representing wisdom or where Poseidon might be representing the forces of water or of earthquakes, but rather of trying to reconcile the authority of the Homeric epics with the current science of the period. So particularly the ideas of the Milesian pre-Socratic philosophers, so the philosophers in Asia Minor, who were really offering new interpretations of how the world works. So offering new principles by which things happen. So that might be about combinations of elements, for instance, or ways of, as it were, rationalising our understanding of how things happen, to say, actually, it's not that it's a specific God intervening, but you can understand this in terms of natural science, of physics, essentially. So that kind of real interest in what we might think of as physics or science coming out. So this seems to be a kind of an interest in how do you bring together the two great authorities of the time, namely the Homeric epics, and these new very radical ways of understanding the world and of agency and causation and things like that in what we might think of as a more scientific mode. So on this model then, we can think of the battle of the gods as we have Poseidon and Apollo, Ares against Athena, kind of gods meeting gods. If we take this as, a claim that gods are fighting gods, that is impious. So this is the fearsome and grievous malice of his accusers, as we hear from Heraclitus in the Homeric questions. So this is the claim that Homer is being impious. However, we can interpret this differently. Actually, if we take this as Athena representing wisdom and Ares representing rash, impetuous folly, then actually what you have is a battle between virtue and vice. The pairing of the gods has the following philosophical significance. Ares is mad and double-faced. Athena is famed for her wisdom. So he says there is, Homer has set out the battle in a way that most helps human life. So he's saying that deranged foolishness won't prevail over intelligence. So Athena defeats Ares because wisdom is going to, never mind that Athena is also goddess of war. You ignore that completely for this interpretation. It's a very, very selective reading of both what these gods stand for, which can change immensely from one paragraph even to the next. There's no systematic attempt to kind of create a coherent doctrine. It's very much applied on a case-by-case basis. So it is not at all that Homer is being impious here in representing the gods fighting one another. No, quite the opposite. If you read it in the right way, and here there is even though Plutarch objects very, very fiercely to allegorical readings, he says they're nonsense, you can see that there is a sense that actually both are saying you just have to learn how to read this poetry in the right way. That there is a kind of a truth and an authority and a wisdom and a morality to it, but you just have to read it correctly. And again, we hear it's not just Athena defeating Ares, but also Aphrodite. So Aphrodite standing in for sort of impulse and sort of lasciviousness and sexuality and things as well. So we can then reinterpret this as an allegory based on psychological traits. And this, of course, became hugely influential in the later tradition going into the medieval period. So thinking about allegories of virtue and vice and so on. So the Battle of the Gods then gives us a kind of a pitched battle between the forces of folly and wisdom. You can alternatively interpret this as, if we go back, for instance, to that, you can interpret that in elemental terms. So Ares and Athena is an ethical opposition, but Poseidon versus Apollo can be seen as water versus fire, for instance. Same again with Hephaestus and Scamander, again the river versus the fire god. So you can see again how this is interpreted as kind of a question of the balance between the different forces of the hot and the cold, for instance, the wet and the dry, that were seen to underpin ancient scientific ideas about how the world works. So the Battle of the Gods is one. One of the other instances that we looked at as particularly controversial is Hera's seduction of Zeus in Iliad 14. So Heraclitus, in his allegorical treatise, says, okay, well, critics find much amusement and opportunity for ridicule in Zeus's untimely sleep and in the mountain bed made ready for him. So he's shown to be animalistic and enslaved. So that's why it's impious, as it represents Zeus, the god of justice, the king of gods and men, and in a sense, a figure who ought to be the most rational, as enslaved, animalistic, and subject to his own desires for sort of sexual desire in particular, but also his sense that he is not, he's neither infallible nor is he omnipotent. So he falls asleep after having sex with Hera, and then that means that he no longer has power over what happens in the battlefield. So Heraclitus' way of redeeming this is to say that it's an allegorical way of speaking of spring. And so one of the things that you see in that passage is that flowers spring up as the two gods, the king and queen of Olympus, have sex. So it's perhaps reading out of some of those details an idea that what we have here is, again, this is a kind of an elemental theory. So we have air, Hera as air, ether as Zeus, combining together. So he represents it as a sort of a purification of the air as it comes into contact with fire. So it's quite a sort of, it's a slightly more outre or sort of sophisticated, we might call it, scientific explanation for what is going on here. Again, about the kind of the workings of the world. He then uses all sorts of other details. So Hera combing her hair as part of this, he says, is plants growing. So the word for foliage in antiquity, they would often use the word chaiter, so hair, so trees have hair. So the claim is that Hera's hair is suggesting the kind of the growth of plants. Hera's perfume, again, is meant to evoke, he says, the scent of flowers. So, once you have this overarching framework in mind, you can then offer some quite sort of subtle proofs of your theory by kind of reading out the details of the Homeric text. So the majority then of these interpretations are either ethical or elemental. Kind of linked to those, we have a series of other approaches or systems we might think of that kind of relate elements of the Homeric epics to elements of the world. So Metrodorus, again, a very shadowy figure. We don't know much more about him, and it's mentioned once or twice, but we don't know very much. But in the classical period, had a kind of a wonderful interpretation of the Iliad. It's one of my personal favourites, this one. So where he mapped on the heroes of the Iliad to parts of the cosmos. At first, this sounds very strange, and you think, well, what on earth is going on here? So Achilles becomes the sun, Hector is the moon, Helen is the earth, Paris is the air, Agamemnon is the ether. And you'll see already that you can pretty much say anybody is the ether or the air. You can chop and change a lot of these theories. They are pretty interchangeable. But and he also had other claims that sort of gods represent different parts of the human body. So Apollo is bile, Demeter is the liver, and Dionysus is the spleen. And we might say that Dionysus will be the liver, but there you go. But actually, the more you look at this, the more it does make partial sense. So if you think about Achilles chasing Hector around Troy, you might think of that as the orbiting of celestial bodies, particularly if you imagine that Troy contains Helen. So you might have this sort of idea that you've got, different planets sort of moving around one another. And there are also ways in which this is picking up some of the language of the kind of gleaming of weaponry in the Homeric epics. And so it's kind of picking up on a lot of the similes and the intense focus on that of the radiance of these figures. And we already saw that Protesilaus and some of the other cult heroes are imagined as radiant in some sense. There are also kind of quite subtle ways in which this is taken to provide proof or to kind of show the Homeric knowledge of all kinds of theories. So again, this is probably related to pre-Socratic theories about the celestial bodies. So the idea that the moon gets its light from the sun. So that is a way of thinking about Hector plundering Achilles' armour from the body of Patroclus. So there we have the moon getting its sort of gleam from the sun, from Achilles. Or the claim that Anaxagoras, one of the pre-Socratic philosophers, made that the sun, when it comes to rise, when you turn to daylight, the sun extinguishes the light of the moon. Well, of course, that's Achilles killing Hector. So these theories then could range from the sort of relatively straightforward idea that Athena represents, in some sense, wisdom, to quite intricate ways of interpreting the Homeric epics as underscoring particular readings or kind of theories about the world that were being put forward by philosophers and kind of physicists, we might call them loosely, of the period. So there's a kind of a defensive way in which allegorical readings are defending Homer against these claims that poetry is deceptive and dangerous. But there's also a way in which this is quite actively seeking to reconcile Homer, the authority of Homer, and kind of co-opt that or redirect that into supporting new intellectual systems, new theories about how the world works. So demonstrating Homeric knowledge, sometimes kind of very anachronistically, of course, of a wide range of topics and theories. So Homer knew the truth about how the world works all the way along, is often the argument. And I can prove that because, he has this. Well, it looks superficially as if it's an impious and blasphemous statement about the gods, but actually it's not, if you know how to read it properly. And just to finish, one of my other favourite ancient critics and sort of intermittent allegorical readers of the Homeric text is the Stoic philosopher Crates of Malice in the 2nd century BC, so kind of a prime period for engagement with the Homeric epics. And I find some of his material particularly interesting because he didn't stop at interpreting the Homeric epics as they survived, but he actually altered the text to make it fit his theories, amongst other things. So, he was a very serious scholar of the Homeric epics, so composed a 9-book commentary on the Homeric epics. Again, a real shame that this material doesn't survive. But he was immensely interested not only in the Homeric epics, but also in geography, astrology, cosmology. So he had kind of, again, what would have at the time been a very scientific interest. And again, this is quite typical, this bringing together of literary or linguistic interest with philosophical interest, with interest in how the world works and knowledge about the world. So he devised what may have been the kind of earliest known globe. He had theories about the different kind of continents and the hemispheres and things like that. But he then edited the text of the Homeric epics in order to support his theories. And I think this is a really interesting moment because it coincides precisely with the drive to edit the text of Homer in order to partly, as it was seen, remove things that had been sort of put in there, had been interspliced, or kind of mistakes or variations to kind of correct and to commentate. But this is a much more active form of editing, so that there were arguments made by Crates that, for instance, Homer knew about specific features. So he uses Homer to support his theory about the geography of the world and his theories about astrology. And sometimes this too has a kind of a rationalizing force. So he's trying to use the Homeric epics to support his own theories, but also to explain away apparent inconsistencies or impieties. So, for instance, the claim that it took the gods 9 days to destroy Troy. Why would it do that? Aren't the gods powerful enough to have done that? He simply, amends that away and says it was destroyed by the gods in a single day. He seems to have spliced in whole sort of additional descriptive sections about things like geography in Homer. So this is really, I think, quite interesting because it's not just a reading strategy, it's also a strategy that combines with philosophical and philological criticism, so linguistic and philosophical criticism, and that's something that the Stoics in particular seem to have been very interested in, is that kind of relationship between different ways of understanding the Homeric text. So one, the kind of the details, the scholarly details of the text in front of you, and secondly, these kind of wider theories about how the world works. So we've seen then that there are a series of strategies put forward by different ancient thinkers about how best to defend Homer about these charges, particularly of impiety, of excessive anthropomorphism, and of deceptive elements in the epics. So Plutarch, in his advice on how you teach young people to read properly, read poetry in particular, says you have to read in the right way, you just have to be a discerning reader. We have a whole range of different strategies for allegoresis, so for offering allegorizing readings, which says that actually it's not really the gods in a sort of very anthropomorphic sense, but rather they stand in for wider principles, so the elements, or for moral characteristics. And we have a kind of an interest in manipulating the epics as well, in order to make them more precisely fit your theories. So no need to alter your theory to fit the text, when you can simply alter the text to fit your theory. So over the course of these sessions, we've been thinking about crucial sort of issues that underpin the way in which the Homeric epics were read in antiquity. So in the first session, we thought about life and death, about the things that are thought to make life worth living, so thinking particularly about Achilles and Odysseus' conversation in the underworld, but also about traditions of Homer's own biography, whether Homer was indeed a single figure who might have been thought to have had a life, a biography, a homeland, and so on. We've looked at the question of poetry and truth, the degree to which in antiquity there were fierce debates, not only about which version of the Homeric epic, given how many multiple variants were circulating about which of these is most authoritative, but about whether Homer was indeed authoritative in essence as a witness to the Trojan War, about that gap, that temporal gap between the time at which the Trojan War was thought to have happened and the time at which the epics themselves were composed. So the problem of how to fill that gap. And we saw different responses to that, including the idea that you can have a figure like Protesilaus, who is a sort of an eternal hero who simply returns across time, who provides a kind of a tangible bridge with the past, and tangible really for the farmer, the vinekeeper, in that he can actually physically embrace him, unlike the ghosts of the underworld that we saw in the first session. So the idea that there is a kind of a gap between the Homeric world and the world depicted in the Homeric epics and the present day, whether that's Homer's own day or the imperial period in which Philostratus' text on heroes was composed. So Protesilaus is one response to that himself, but also the ways in which he criticises Homeric authority as a sort of historiographical eyewitness to what really happened, the truth of those stories. And that's a theme we traced last week in looking at Helen, where there are kind of correctives to the Homeric account, including the idea that Helen wasn't really at Troy, as well as debates about the question of responsibility and agency, how in the Homeric world that is very rarely clear-cut, that you have gods interfering in mortal life the whole time, what that does to the question of responsibility, and the ways in which responsibility, blame and agency are much more kind of complex and convoluted and disparate than might at first seem. And we looked at the case of Helen's own defence of herself from the Trojan women as one way of thinking about that, as well as traditions of Helen in the underworld, and the question of how do you assign responsibility and blame? How do you judge the case of Helen? Something that was very literally going on in front of our very eyes in the underworld, that Helen was still being judged and her case adjudicated. And today we've been looking at both criticism of the Homeric epics for the portrayal of the gods and also responses to that. So I think one strand that's united all of these is the idea that in the Homeric world, really, that there is a kind of a degree of moral ambiguity that runs all the way through, that these questions are not simple even in Homer, and that was a prompt both for attempts to criticise and make sense of the Homeric epics. The idea that you can either create a sort of a systematic reading of this material, but that is something that can be used both to support the authority of the Homeric epics or to reject it. And that's something that we've seen today in particular. But that in each of these cases, it's the very authority of Homer that prompts the fierceness both of the support and these criticisms of Homer. That Homer in the ancient world was never simply accepted at face value in all contexts, but was continually the impulse to, prompted the impulse to rewrite, to think through, to respond, to defend, or to criticise.